Super Castlevania IV whipped its way onto your Super NES back in 1991. Developed and published by Konami, Castlevania IV was the first 16-bit outing for the already insanely popular series centered around taking down Dracula and his minions of the night. The previous three NES Castlevania games had already cemented the series as the top of its class in terms of being the gold standard for what a brutally challenging action platform game should be, sitting right next to the likes of Ninja Gaiden and Konami's other crown jewel, the Contra series. And since this was going to be Konami's first major release of Castlevania for the hot new Super NES, the hype machine was out in full force, with the likes of Nintendo Power and pretty much every other gaming magazine tossing out huge previews in the hopes of getting us kids to beg our parents for money so that we could check out Simon Belmont's first big 16-bit adventure. Though we did unfortunately miss out on this absolutely amazing Japanese Castlevania IV commercial that's just, well, it's something. But honestly, nothing else really needed to be said besides the word super and Castlevania in the same sentence to get us frothing at the mouth for the idea of seeing what Castlevania would be like on the Super NES. But at the end of the day, was Super Castlevania IV worthy of the Belmont name? Or should this one have stayed buried in Dracula's coffin? Well, grab your favorite whip and bottle of holy water, because we're about to see if Super Castlevania IV still goes for the 16-bit jugular. Start the game up and you're greeted to one of the spookiest title screens ever, followed by a lot of scrolling text explaining the whole reason as to why Dracula's bad and why you gotta kill him and stuff. This is essentially the same story from the original Castlevania game, but from what the instructions tell you, Castlevania IV is supposed to be a sequel to the game, which would kinda be odd since this game takes place 100 years after that game, yet you're still playing as Simon Belmont. The director of the game has said several times though that this is actually supposed to be a remake of the first game, which makes a lot more sense. So it's just best to go with that and ignore what those lying bastard of instructions told you. Anyway, once you've sat through seemingly 10 minutes of text scroll, seriously, what's up with Castlevania games and their insanely long text scrolls? Then go ahead and press start to get out there and find Dracula so that you can put him back in his casket where he belongs. If you jump into Super Castlevania thinking you're in for the same old weighty, rigid movement and jumping from the NES Castlevania games, then you're about to be in for a rather pleasant surprise. Apparently, Simon Belmont has been taking some calisthenics classes, as he no longer feels like you're trying to navigate a small car through a platform game. Yes, not only does Simon feel much faster and nimbler overall, but he can now do things that was an impossible dream in previous games, like change direction mid-jump and even do a crouch walk for no real reason other than just to make you realize how much of a human brick he was in previous games. This all-new mobility also extends to your whip, as you can now slap things with it in just about any direction you can press. No longer are you limited to one single forward attack, and you're now treated to 180 degrees of hardcore whip action. Whether you're standing still or jumping, you now have the freedom to come at enemies at all angles, and it honestly makes it feel like a totally different game. You can even slap your whip around in any direction if you hold the attack button down, which honestly just is more hilarious than anything else. All the classic special weapons make a return to Super Castlevania like boomerangs, daggers, and axes, but these take on a much less important role this time around, since Simon is more than capable of making up for the bonuses that having these weapons in previous games provided. Since there's just not much of a reason to toss out a slow-moving axe when you can just smack things diagonally all day long with your whip now. All of this really does make Super Castlevania feel completely unique, and much more like an action game than previous Castlevania games. Instead of carefully inching forward, you can suddenly be far more aggressive now this time around. At least until a Medusa head knocks you off a platform and into a pit, making you realize that yes, even with all of these improvements, this is still very much a Castlevania game. Once you're done flailing your whip around like a lunatic, it's time to make your way to Dracula's castle by navigating your way through several stages filled with crazy traps and an army of the dead and undead standing in your way. Unlike the original Castlevania where you spend the majority of the game wrecking Dracula's castle, Super Castlevania has you spending a lot of time outside, as you'll be making your way through forests, caves, and ruins before you can even get to Dracula's crusty abode. And when you do finally make it to the castle thinking you've made it to the final stage, the game opens up even further with an entirely new map screen, showing that you now have to navigate several more stages inside the castle to make it to Dracula's inner chamber. This was actually a really cool moment as a kid, since it was like finding out there was another half to the game hidden away that you only knew about if you actually made it to the castle. All of this adds up to a ton of locations to fight your way through, and amazingly, no two sections ever feel the same. Just when you get tired of endlessly slapping ghosts and zombies around, the game tosses in an entire section where you're jumping across massive swinging chandeliers, or using Mode 7 to rotate an entire stage as you hang on for dear life with your whip. And while the game isn't incredibly long, it does manage to feel like a much longer game due to the sheer amount of stuff that you'll see and do before the credits roll. Being a huge fan of the original Castlevania games on the NES, I could not wait to get my hands on Super Castlevania. And when it finally did hit the shelf of my local video store, I immediately snatched it up with all the speed that a fat 10-year-old kid could muster. Now this is usually a recipe for disaster, since just about any game I endlessly hyped up in my own head would more often than not lead me crashing back down to earth when I finally did get to sit down and play it. Super Castlevania though was not one of those games. Everything from the new, faster gameplay, the insane graphical upgrade and Mode 7 effects, to the stunning music was everything you could ever hope for if you were a Castlevania fan. In this day and age, I don't think I can overstate just how big of a jump Super Castlevania was over its NES counterparts in just about every way. It was simply mind-blowing at the time. I remember thinking that the music by itself was so good that I actually took the time to record each track onto a cassette tape by sitting my stereo up next to the TV and recording it. Yes, the struggle was very real back in 1991. In the end, there's just about nothing I can complain about here, and I feel like I'd be trying a bit too hard to sit and nitpick this game, since I think that's just about what you'd have to do to find much fault with it at all. Sure, there are people that prefer the classic NES gameplay over the faster, more agile Simon Belmont in this game, but that really just comes down to personal preference. For me, Super Castlevania has always been the pinnacle of the Castlevania series, right next to Symphony of the Night. Where Symphony was a completely new take on the series, I feel like that Super Castlevania essentially perfected the classic Castlevania style of games. And it goes without saying that if you've somehow never played Super Castlevania, then you need to put this one at the top of your list ASAP. And even if you're not a Castlevania fan due to the difficulty and rigidness of the NES games, you may still want to check out this all-time classic, just because of how much easier it is to play. And at the end of the day, there's few things more fun than slapping Dracula in the head with your whip, and Super Castlevania IV does that better than just about any game out there.